There's a particular hour of the night that anxiety seems to own. Somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, the house is quiet. Everyone else is asleep. And your mind is wide awake, running through the same loop it ran last night. The bill, the diagnosis, the conversation you have to have tomorrow, the child you're worried about, the thing you said 6 years ago that still makes you wince. You're exhausted. You want to stop, and you cannot stop. If you know that hour, this video is for you. Because here's what most people don't realize. 2,000 years ago, in a sermon delivered on a hillside to a crowd of ordinary, exhausted working people, Jesus took on this exact problem. Not vaguely, not in passing. He built an entire, carefully structured argument about worry. And he ended it with a command that sounds almost impossible when you first read it. He said, "Therefore, do not be anxious." Now, be honest. When you hear that, part of you probably wants to push back. Because telling an anxious person not to be anxious is like telling a drowning person not to be wet. It doesn't help. You can't just decide to stop. If you could, you'd have done it years ago. So either Jesus didn't understand anxiety, or we've been reading him wrong. And I want to tell you up front, it's the second one. What Jesus says in that sermon is not a scolding. It's not positive thinking. It's not just have more faith. It is, when you look at it closely, one of the most careful, practical, psychologically astute pieces of teaching in ancient literature. He isn't shaming the worried. He's giving them a series of arguments. He's reasoning with them. He asks questions. He points at birds. He points at flowers. He builds a case, step by step. And then he lands on a single sentence at the end that, if you actually understood it, would change how you sleep. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk through this passage slowly, the way you'd walk through it if a friend sat down with you and said, "Wait, look at what he's actually doing here." We're going to ask why anxiety has such a grip on us, what Jesus says is really happening underneath it, and why his solution isn't try harder to relax, but something else entirely, something almost nobody talks about. And along the way, I'm going to answer 3 questions that people always ask when this passage comes up. First, is worry actually a sin? Because a lot of anxious Christians have been told it is, and that has done enormous damage. Second, what's the difference between worry and responsible planning? Because Jesus clearly isn't telling us to quit our jobs and stop paying rent. And third, the big one, what do you do when you've prayed and you've trusted, and the anxiety is still there in the morning? We'll get to all 3. But let's start where he starts. The setting matters. So picture it. A hillside in Galilee. A crowd has gathered, and this is not a comfortable crowd. These are peasants and fishermen and day laborers living under Roman occupation. Many of them genuinely did not know where the next meal was coming from. When Jesus talks about worrying over food and clothing, he is not speaking to people who are anxious about whether they got the right sofa. He is speaking to people for whom the question, "What will we eat?" was a real and pressing threat. And that's important, because it kills the first objection immediately. Jesus isn't talking down to worriers from a position of comfort. He's standing in front of people with every reason to be afraid. And he's saying, "I know. And still, look at this." Here's the passage, Matthew chapter 6. He says, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing?" He asks a question. Is not life more than food? He doesn't say stop worrying. He asks you to consider something. And that word therefore at the beginning is doing heavy lifting too, because it means this teaching is the conclusion of something that came just before it. And what came before it? A statement about money. He just said you cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money. So the very first thing Jesus links anxiety to is not weak faith. It's the question of what you're actually serving. What has your allegiance? What you've quietly decided is holding your life together. Hold on to that, because it's going to matter enormously later. But for now, notice that his opening move is a question about proportion. Is life more than food? Is the body more than clothing? He's asking you to notice that you are more than the things you're anxious about. The anxiety has convinced you that your entire existence is riding on this one thing: the money, the illness, the job. And he stops and says, wait, is that true? Is your life really smaller than the thing you're afraid of losing? That's not a scolding. That's a doctor gently pressing on the sore spot to find out where it hurts. And then he does something so simple. People have been quoting it for 2 millennia. He points at a bird. Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? Now, I want to be careful here, because this verse gets used badly. It gets used to tell struggling people that they should just relax and God will drop money into their lap. That is not what he's saying. And if you've ever had that verse quoted at you while you were terrified about rent, you know how hollow it can feel. So look at what he's actually doing. He's making an argument from the lesser to the greater, a standard form of reasoning in his world. It goes like this. If the smaller thing is true, then the greater thing must be even more true. If God sustains the sparrow, a creature nobody notices, worth almost nothing at the market, then what does that imply about how he regards you? Notice he doesn't say the birds don't work. Birds work constantly. Any bird you've ever watched is hunting, building, feeding, exhausting itself. What he says is they don't sow and reap and gather into barns. They don't hoard against an imagined future. They don't lie awake at 3 a.m. running the numbers on next winter. They do today's work today, and they are fed. Which raises the second question I promised, and let's deal with it right now because it's probably nagging at you. What is the actual difference between worry and responsible planning? Because Jesus is clearly not telling you to skip work. He's not telling you to ignore the bills or the symptoms or the deadline. Here's the line, and it's a clean one. Planning takes an action in the present about the future. Worry takes an emotion in the present about the future. Planning says, I will set aside this money. I will make this appointment. I will have this conversation. Worry says, I will feel the pain of this now, and again tonight, and again tomorrow, and I will keep feeling it, and none of it will change what happens. Planning is what you do. Worry is what you carry. And here's the test, if you want a practical one. Ask yourself, does this thought lead to an action? If yes, it's planning. Do the action. If it doesn't lead to any action, if it just circles and returns to the same fear it started with, that's not preparation. That's suffering in advance. You are paying interest on a debt that may never come due. Jesus says something almost exactly like that a few verses later. He says, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Sit with the honesty of that line for a second. He doesn't say tomorrow will be fine. He doesn't say your fears are silly and nothing bad will happen. He says tomorrow has its own trouble. He is straightforwardly acknowledging that trouble is coming, that life contains real difficulty, and it will find you on schedule. What he's saying is that you don't have to carry tomorrow's trouble today on top of today's, because you were never given the strength for 2 days at once. You were given today's strength for today's trouble. That's the arrangement. And every night that you lie awake carrying tomorrow, you are spending strength you were given for today on a burden that hasn't arrived and may never arrive at all. But now we come to the question that people ask most, and it's the one that causes the deepest pain. So let's stop and deal with it honestly. Because if you're an anxious person, you may have had this passage used against you. Someone may have said, Jesus commands you not to worry. You're worrying. Therefore, you're disobeying. And now, on top of your anxiety, you carry guilt about your anxiety, which, as anyone who's lived with it knows, is like pouring gasoline on a fire to put it out. You get anxious about being anxious. You pray for peace and then feel like a failure for not having it, which makes you more afraid, which makes you pray more desperately, which makes the failure feel worse. If that's where you are right now, I want you to hear this next part slowly. Look at how Jesus actually handles frightened people. Look at the whole of the Gospels. When the disciples are in the boat and the storm is breaking over them and they're absolutely terrified, Jesus doesn't leave them in the water to teach them a lesson. He calms the storm. Yes, he asks them where their faith is, but he calms the storm. When a father comes to him desperate about his sick child and blurts out that broken, honest sentence, "I believe, help my unbelief," Jesus doesn't send him away for having imperfect faith. He heals the boy. When Peter starts to sink, Jesus doesn't lecture him from the surface of the water. The text says immediately he reached out his hand and caught him. The lecture, such as it is, comes after Peter is safe.
So no, the command, "do not be anxious," is not a club to beat yourself with. Read it in context, and it isn't even primarily a command about your feelings. It's an invitation to reconsider what you believe about the God who is holding you. Anxiety, in the Bible's language, is not usually treated as a moral crime. It's treated as a symptom, a signal, telling you something about where you've placed your trust and about what you've come to believe you must control in order to survive. Which brings us to what I think is the single most important thing in this whole passage, and it's the thing almost nobody notices because it's hidden in one small word. Because Jesus is about to tell us what anxiety actually is, not what it feels like, what it is. And when you see it, you'll understand why just stop worrying was never the solution, and what he offers instead. Here's the word. Watch for it. Jesus says, "And which of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life?" Add. That's the word. He's talking about addition, about gain. He's pointing out that anxiety presents itself as productive. It feels like you're doing something. It feels like vigilance, like preparation, like responsibility. Your mind is working. It's late and you're going over the problem again and again because some part of you believes that if you just think about it hard enough, long enough, from enough angles, you will find the thread that unravels it. You will get control. And Jesus asks quietly, has that ever worked? Has 1 hour of it ever added 1 hour to your life? Now here's the thing that turns it. He isn't just saying worry is useless. He's saying worry is an attempt. It's an attempt to do something that only God can do. Every anxious loop at 3 a.m. is, at bottom, a small act of trying to hold the universe together with your own hands at night, alone, in the dark, using nothing but your mind. That's what anxiety is in the Bible's picture. It is not weakness. It is not cowardice.
Anxiety is the exhausting labor of trying to be God over your own life, trying to guarantee an outcome that was never yours to guarantee. And it wears you out precisely because you were never built to carry it. You were not designed to bear the weight of the future. That job is taken.
And now, suddenly, that therefore at the beginning makes complete sense. Remember what came right before? You cannot serve both God and money. Anxiety, it turns out, is a worship problem. Not in the sense that anxious people are idolaters who deserve blame. That's exactly the wrong reading. But in the sense that anxiety reveals what we have quietly come to believe is holding us up, what we think our safety actually rests on. When that thing is threatened, the savings, the health, the relationship, the plan, the alarm goes off inside us and it doesn't stop. Because we sense correctly that the thing we were leaning on cannot bear our weight.
The anxiety isn't the disease, it's the symptom. It's the pain that tells you you're leaning on something that was never strong enough. And that reframing changes what the solution has to be. Because if anxiety is an attempt to control what you can't control, then stop worrying is not a solution. It's just a demand to stop doing the only thing you know how to do. You'd have to have somewhere else to put the weight. You'd need a different place to lean.
Now understand the choice of image, because it's not sentimental. He picks wildflowers, not garden flowers tended and watered and admired. Wildflowers, growing out on a Galilean hillside where perhaps nobody would ever see them. And then he says something almost harsh. If God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is alive and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you? Thrown into the oven. He's saying these flowers are temporary. Dried grass and wildflowers were literally used as fuel. They bloom for a few days in extravagant, useless beauty. Beauty that no one commissioned, that serves no economic purpose, that will be gone by the weekend and burned as kindling.
And God dressed them anyway, better than Solomon. Sit with that a moment, because I think it's one of the most tender things in the Gospels, and people rush right past it. What Jesus is telling you is that God is not a strict accountant of usefulness. He is not a manager calculating whether you're worth the investment. He clothes a weed in glory for a Tuesday afternoon that nobody will witness. He does it because that is his nature, because he is generous in a way that makes no economic sense.
And here we have to be very careful and very honest, because this is where cheap teaching does terrible damage. Jesus does not promise you a life without loss. He never once promises that. He promised his own followers that in this world they would have trouble. He told them they'd be hated. Almost all of them died badly. He himself was tortured to death. Whatever this passage is offering, it is not a guarantee that nothing bad will happen to you. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something, and the Bible itself will contradict them. So, what is he saying?
Look at the exact words. Your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. Knows. That's the promise. Not that you will never lack, that you are never unknown, that you are not an oversight, not a rounding error, not a soul that slipped through the cracks of an inattentive universe. The specific relief Jesus offers is not the guarantee of a good outcome. It is the guarantee of a father's attention. And I know how that sounds if you're in real trouble. So let me put it plainly. If your fear is something terrible might happen, Jesus does not say nothing terrible will happen. He says you will not face it alone, unnoticed, unloved, and unheld. That's a different promise.
It's a smaller promise in one sense and infinitely larger in another. Because most of the terror and suffering is not the suffering itself. It's the loneliness of it. It's the fear that you are falling through empty space and nobody is watching and nobody will catch you and nothing means anything. And into that, he says, your Father knows. Now, he's diagnosed the disease, he's shown you the evidence, and here comes the prescription. One sentence, and it is the hinge of the entire passage. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Seek first. Notice what he does not say. He does not say, stop seeking. He doesn't tell you to become passive, to stop caring about your life, to sit in a room and go blank. Anxiety, remember, is a form of seeking, a frantic, exhausted, midnight seeking after security. Jesus doesn't tell you to stop looking for security. He tells you where to look. This is the whole thing. This is why just don't worry never worked, and why this actually does. He doesn't hand you an emptiness. He hands you a substitution. He knows that a heart that has been ripped away from the thing it was clinging to will simply grab the next thing it can reach, unless it is given something better to hold. To seek the kingdom first is to make God's rule and God's character the actual foundation your life is standing on, rather than the ornamental roof on top of a foundation made of money, health, reputation, or control. And you can tell what your foundation is very easily. Just notice what, if it were taken away tomorrow, would make you feel that your life was over. That's the foundation. That's what you're really building on. Not what you say you believe, what you'd be destroyed to lose. And here is the mercy hidden inside the terror of that question. If your foundation is money, money can be lost. If it's your health can fail. If it's another person, that person is mortal. If it's your reputation, a single email can end it. Every one of those foundations can be taken, and some part of you knows it. That's what the alarm at 3 a.m. actually is. It is your soul, quite correctly, informing you that the ground you're standing on is not solid. To seek first the kingdom is to say, my life is finally resting on the character of God, and there is no circumstance in this world with the power to take that away from me. Not illness, not bankruptcy, not betrayal, not even death, which is the one all the others are really pointing at anyway. And notice, and this is so important, he says, and all these things will be added to you. Added. Not, and you'll get rich. Added. Not, and nothing will go wrong. The word means these things will come along with, in their proper place, in their proper size. What Jesus is describing isn't a life where food and clothing and safety cease to matter. It's a life where they've been put back where they belong, as gifts received, rather than God served. And a strange thing happens when you actually do that, when you stop demanding that the created thing be your foundation. You can finally enjoy it as a gift. The money stops being your God and becomes your tool. The relationship stops being your salvation and becomes your joy. The work stops being your identity and becomes your calling. You have not lost anything. You've just stopped asking a good thing to be a God, which it could never survive being, and which was crushing both of you. Because your nervous system is not a spiritual scoreboard. Some of you have brains that produce adrenaline on a hair trigger, for reasons that go back to genetics or trauma or a childhood where the ground really did move under your feet. Some of you have a thyroid condition. Some of you are running on 4 hours of sleep and too much caffeine,
and grief you never processed. That is not sin. That is a body. And the Bible has a strikingly high view of bodies. It never once treats you as a soul that happens to be wearing meat. You are an embodied creature, and embodied creatures have limits.
Look at how God treats his exhausted prophets. Elijah, after the greatest spiritual victory of his life, collapses under a tree and asks God to let him die. And what does God do? Does he rebuke him? Does he say, after everything I've done for you, this is your faith? No. He lets him sleep. Then he sends an angel with food and lets him sleep again, twice. Bread and rest, twice, before a single word of correction or commission. The most spiritual thing that happens in that story is a nap and a meal. If God ministered to a suicidal prophet with sleep and bread, then let go of the idea that your anxiety is a moral failure. Sometimes the holiest thing available to you is to eat something, drink water, and go to bed.
Whatever theology you hold this too. The man who said, "Do not be anxious," spent the last night of his life in agony, on the ground, begging. So we are absolutely not talking about a stoic. We're not talking about a man who never felt dread and can't understand why you do. When Jesus says, "Do not be anxious," those words are coming from someone who has been further into the dark than you have ever been, and who came out the other side with his trust intact, not because he never trembled, but because he kept talking to his Father while he trembled. And look at what he actually does in that garden, because it's the practical answer to our question. He is honest, brutally honest about what he wants. Let this cup pass from me. He doesn't pretend to be fine. He doesn't perform serenity for God's benefit. And then he adds one more line. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Nevertheless.
That word is the whole Christian answer to anxiety, and it fits on a coin. It's not denial. He doesn't say the cup isn't bitter. He says it is bitter, and I don't want it, and I'm telling you I don't want it. Nevertheless, I trust you more than I trust my own reading of this moment. That's what faith actually looks like at 3 a.m. It is not the absence of fear. It is fear that keeps talking to God instead of talking only to itself. Because that's really what anxiety is, isn't it? Anxiety is a conversation you're having with yourself in a closed room where you are simultaneously the frightened one and the only advisor available. And of course it spirals. Of course it never resolves. You've locked out the only other voice in the room. Prayer in the Bible is not primarily a technique for getting outcomes. It is the act of opening that door. It is refusing to have the conversation alone.
So the picture is this. The trouble is still outside the walls. It hasn't gone. But something has been stationed between the trouble and your heart. That's what he's offering. Not the removal of the storm. A garrison in the middle of it. And Paul knew this personally, in a way that should be a comfort to every one of you who has prayed and not received. He describes some affliction. He calls it a thorn in the flesh, and he never tells us what it was, which I've always thought was a mercy, because it means anyone can put their own thing in that space. And he says he pleaded with the Lord 3 times to take it away. 3 times. The same number as Gethsemane. And God said, no. He said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Read that carefully. The thorn stayed. The prayer, in the way Paul wanted, was not answered. And Paul, on the other side of that, writes some of the most joyful sentences in human literature. Not because he got what he asked for, because he found that what he was given instead was enough.
So here's the answer to the last question, as honestly as I can give it. When you have prayed and trusted, and the anxiety is still there in the morning, you have not failed. You are standing exactly where Elijah stood, under the tree, and where Paul stood with his thorn, and where Jesus knelt in the dirt of Gethsemane. You are in the best company there has ever been. And the instruction is not to fix yourself before God will have you. It is to keep the door open, to keep saying out loud if you have to, "This is bitter. I don't want it. Nevertheless."
And then to do the small, unspiritual-looking things. Sleep. Eat. Tell one person the truth about how you are. If your body is unwell, let a doctor help you. Luke, who wrote a quarter of the New Testament, was a physician, and nobody told him his medicine was a failure of faith. Take today's trouble today. Just today. That's all you were ever asked to carry. Because this is where the whole thing has been going, and it's the last thing I want to leave with you. Anxiety is, at its root, a question about whether you are alone, whether anyone is actually there, whether the universe is a cold room or a father's house. Every anxious loop is a fist closing tighter around a life you're afraid nobody else is holding. And the entire answer of the Christian faith is not an argument. It's a person. It's a man in a garden, sweating blood, who did not run, who took the cup he had begged to avoid and drank it so that you would never have to face the dark unaccompanied. The one who says, "Do not be anxious," has personally been where you go at 3 a.m., and he did not lose his father there, and he will not lose you. Not your problems aren't real, not nothing bad will happen. Just you are known, you are seen, you are counted, and you are held. And the birds are fed and the flowers are dressed, and you are worth more than all of it. So when it comes tonight, and it may come tonight, don't fight it alone in a closed room. Open the door. Say the honest thing. Add the nevertheless. And then close your eyes, because tomorrow's trouble is not yours yet, and it never was. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble, and sufficient for that trouble is the one who holds the day.
If this reached you tonight, or if it named something you've been carrying and couldn't say out loud, would you do one thing? Send it to someone who's been struggling. You probably know exactly who they are. And leave a comment, even one word, because there is someone else reading who needs to know they're not the only one awake right now. Subscribe if you'd like to keep walking through Scripture together. And if the weight you're carrying is more than anxiety, if you're in real crisis tonight, please reach out to someone you trust, or to a professional, or to a crisis line where you are. That is not weakness. It's the bread and the sleep under the tree. It's exactly what God gave his prophet before he gave him anything else. Pray for us, and God bless you.